Hello and welcome to the Sam Mariello Show. I hope you're doing great. I hope your Sunday is going great. Today we have a really interesting topic, and we're gonna have to start with a really nice video that we got from David Earles from a protest that happened just yesterday in Montreal. So you might be wondering what that was, and I have brought Ted to help us get through what happened yesterday. So, hi Ted, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course. So how was the protest yesterday?
It was good. And so, as you maybe saw in the video, we had maybe 30 or 40 people outside the gates of Bordeaux in a sort of festive atmosphere, chanting slogans, playing music, and calling for a variety of changes depending on the participants, from closing down prisons entirely to prioritizing the vaccination of prisoners at Bordeaux for COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I was wondering if you could just give us like an overview of like what's happening at Bordeaux.
Well, presently, Bordeaux is coming off of a second huge wave of COVID-19 infections. Bordeaux is the largest provincial prison in Quebec. It has somewhere between 850 and 900 prisoners on a day-to-day basis. It's a provincial prison, so people are either doing a sentence of 2 years minus a day or less, or they're being held pre-trial. So they haven't been sentenced yet, or they haven't been convicted. About 70% of people in Bordeaux are being held before their trial, so they haven't been convicted of any crime. For those who have a sentence, their sentences average about 3 months, so very short terms.
Hmm.
And for a variety of reasons, Bordeaux has been the hardest hit provincial prison in Quebec by COVID. In the first wave, just as Montreal was very hard hit by the outbreak, Bordeaux prison was extremely hard hit. There were over 100 people infected at one point in time. The entire prison was on lockdown, meaning people are confined to their cells 24 hours a day. One person, Robert Langevin, died, which another way of saying it is that he was killed by the prison. He was the first person infected by COVID. He was calling for help, asking for medical treatment. He was totally ignored by prison guards who told him to shut his mouth. And he died there in his cell. And he was a man in his 70s in for selling speed, pretty minor infraction. And then in
Mm-hmm.
the second wave, just as Montreal was hard hit in the second wave by COVID, Bordeaux was hit hard again. Over 100 people tested positive for COVID. The whole prison went on lockdown 24 hours a day inside people's cells. And at least two sectors were on 24-hour lockdown for almost 3 weeks. And so that's 3 weeks sitting inside your cell with absolutely nothing to do. And there were hunger strikes at various points in time. There was about a 10-day hunger strike during the first wave of the pandemic. People calling for various measures, including at that point just access to PPE, but also decarceration, allowing as many people to leave the prison as possible to socially distance in their communities.
Mm-hmm.
And in the second wave, we had very short episodic hunger strikes. For example, one sector was on lockdown 24 hours a day for 2 weeks, even though no one had tested positive in that sector. And people went on hunger strike to be released. And after about 8 hours, they were allowed to leave their cells. And so there's been a lot of resistance from prisoners, which has been, quite inspiring because they're doing it under incredibly difficult conditions. It's very hard to organize when you're confined to your cell 24 hours
Mm-hmm.
a day.
Mm-hmm. I'm really shocked by the conditions that are in the prisons right now. And just to be clear, so there's over a majority of the people at Bordeaux have not officially like committed a crime. Like they're not officially considered to have committed a crime, you said?
Right, they're being held on what's called remand. In French, they're prévenus. They're being held awaiting their trial
Mm-hmm.
or their conviction or their sentence. So yeah, between 60 and 70% of them have not been convicted of a crime,
Okay,
and
so
that's
like,
and that's common for provincial prisons.
okay, yeah. It's just like shocking because it's like before even being committed of like to the crime, like you're already in this situation.
Hmm.
Not to say that prisoners should have like these terrible conditions in the prisons, but it's just shocking to know that like even before you're like officially accused of it, you're going through this experience.
And there's
Um,
and that's the result of changes over the last 20 years. We didn't used to hold so many people pre-trial. The
mm,
largest reason for prison population growth in Canada over the last 20 years has been an increase in holding people for remand in provincial prisons.
mm,
And the provincial prisons are often bursting at the seams. New prisons are being proposed, like the construction of new prisons, all because we've made a decision that we want to hold people pre-trial in greater numbers. People's trials are often also take longer to reach their conclusion, and so we
mm,
have a vast increase of people who often, when they finally get their conviction, they're released because they've already done the time that they were sentenced to.
mm. Do you know why this change happened?
It's part of a broader, law and order campaign that, unfortunately, at the federal level, is supported by the three major political parties. And so the leading proponents, of course, are the conservatives, especially under Harper, who established a whole series of mandatory minimum sentences, often for very minor offenses. So people are doing mandatory time in prison for these offenses. There's a lot of scaremongering on the rare case that someone commits another crime while they're awaiting their trial. That mobilizes the right. But basically, the entire political spectrum is able to mobilize energy to say that we need these people incarcerated. And that also includes, immigrant detention. We didn't used to hold
Mm,
migrants in detention facilities at all. That began, 20 or 30 years ago. It used to be that people, were migrants were here. They'd have their immigration hearing, and if they were ordered deported, they'd be deported, and that was the whole system. That's not a
mm,
just system either. They should be allowed to stay, but we didn't used to hold hundreds of people of migrants in detention facilities. So there's been a vilification of a certain sector of the Canadian population over that time, and that corresponds with more brutal policing, expansion of prisons at the provincial and federal level, and immigrant detention.
mm-hmm. So not only are these prison populations growing, but it seems like the conditions that they're being subjected to are not good and getting worse, it seems.
Well, conditions are very bad, right? And one of the
Mm,
things I think that's really helpful, or that the pandemic forces us to grapple with, is the way that the pandemic has made visible a bunch of vulnerabilities and injustices that existed before the pandemic. And so, in terms of long-term care facilities for seniors, it's made it really clear that these are dangerous, badly organized, badly funded, badly staffed places, and they were that before the pandemic. We'll see whether that results in any changes in the long-term care facilities, but there is at least like a prise de conscience. In the prison system, it should spark the same kind of attention. I don't know whether it will because it's much easier to just abandon people. But prior to the pandemic, healthcare in prisons is terrible, notoriously terrible. Healthcare in prisons for most people involves getting a Tylenol, no matter what your condition is. Life
okay.
expectancies are much lower for prisoners than they are for the everyday population. Food in prison is terrible. And prisons have become our way of dealing with mental illness, and they also produce mental illness. Like, we'll find out, I suppose, 5 years later, what the mental health implications have been of using lockdown in prisons as a so-called public health measure. I mean,
Mm,
I haven't heard a medical professional, do research on what this impact has been so far. But we're talking about prisons across Canada where the moment there's a small outbreak of COVID, rather than doing any number of things that could deal with a public health situation, they're just locking people in their cells 24 hours a day.
mm-hmm,
And Canadian courts have recognized solitary confinement of 15 days or more as a form of torture. And there they mean solitary confinement of 22 hours out of your 24 hours a day. And here we're talking about people who are in their cells 24 hours a day for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. The long-term impacts on people's mental health are going to be dramatic.
Yeah. I know that you interviewed an ex-prisoner maybe like a month ago, and I saw that interview, and I mean, it really seemed like he didn't enjoy his experience at all. I think it must have really affected him. One thing I noticed is like he kept talking about his contact with like his spouse, and apparently he would only get like 2 or 3 minutes. I don't know if it's like per day or per week, but like it was very little time to actually like hear from his spouse like during this time. Uh, it just seems like the conditions right now are really bad, and you know, like I understand the concept of like punishing people, but at the same time, I don't think we should be violating like their rights. You know, like they should at least be given like a certain standard for now. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just been extra punishment from the beginning of
Hmm.
the pandemic, and so every possible, if you have an array of things you could do to deal with a public health crisis like COVID, if it's punitive, the prisons did it, and if it's not punitive, the prisons didn't do it. And so there's been no social programs, any education programs, any religious programs, recreation programs in prisons since March of last year. The library's been closed. The gyms have been closed. People had limited access to outside yard time during the summer, and now they have almost none. Visits are totally annulled. And so, yeah. And then in moments of lockdown, the prison doesn't communicate with family members. If family members call and ask what's going on, they don't get any information.
Hmm.
And usually, what happens is in a lockdown situation, the guards will walk by with a cell phone and give people a 5-minute call every 3 or 4 days. And that wasn't even done at the beginning. And
Hmm.
so, there is obviously a toll on people's family members who feel desperate and feel like their loved ones are vulnerable because they absolutely are. They're not in a space where they're going to be cared for at all if they contract COVID, for example.
Hmm. Yeah, it doesn't look good at all. I'm glad that we're bringing more visibility to it. I really appreciate the fact that you and everyone else went to the protest yesterday. I'm wondering, did have any government officials like responded to this situation?
Uh, I mean, they've responded, they've had to respond, right? And so from the beginning of the pandemic, an array of organizations, including the little organization that I'm part of, Anti-Carceral Group, but ranging all the way to very mainstream organizations like the Elizabeth Fry Society, the Bar Association, et cetera, have been calling for rapid decarceration of prisons so that people can socially distance in their communities. And so anyone remaining in prison has more space inside to be safe. A few provinces managed to reduce their provincial prison populations during the first wave, sometimes by 25 to 40%. Nova Scotia went the farthest in that respect. But at the federal level, there was no decarceration. And the Quebec prison system, there was no decarceration. And it's not surprising. We have, as Minister of Public Security at the federal level, Bill Blair, who's a career cop and a particularly brutal one in Toronto, and he's in charge of so-called public security, which means he's in charge of the prison system, and he has rebuffed any suggestion that people should be released.
Mm.
So he's content with forcibly exposing people to danger and using torture, in other words, solitary confinement as the major public health measure. And in Quebec, of course, there's been no response. And so even when it comes to questions of vaccinating prisoners for COVID, the federal government is doing a little bit of vaccination. Some provinces are, but Quebec hasn't made any moves on that yet. They say that they'll vaccinate prisoners in the fourth stage, which is when they're vaccinating the general population. Even though we know that prisoners are 7 times more likely to get COVID than the general population because they're in a confined environment. We
Mm.
seem to be very well able to understand that a school provides a laboratory for the propagation of COVID. We seem to be able to recognize that even a gym or a bar is, long-term care facilities are, but we are not treating prisons in the same respect. And obviously, this is because we've dehumanized prisoners. We imagine that people who are in prison have done something horrible, that they're a danger to the public, and that they deserve what they get. And that's a massive misunderstanding of the way our society works. Most people in prison haven't harmed anyone. Harm exists throughout our society. If you have privilege of wealth or race, you can commit harm and you won't go to prison. And most of the people who are in prison will get out fairly soon. So if our only way of keeping people safe is to keep people in prison, it's not a very good system because there are people who are harming people everywhere in a society, and most people will get out. So this, to me, is a moment where, like the way that we're taking a hard look at a lot of our institutions in society, it's really time to think about, why we've invested so much in prisons, why we believe that prisons are necessary to prevent harm. When if you think about it and talk to people about it or read about it for like a couple hours, you realize that this is not a good system. It doesn't prevent harm. It mostly serves the ends of oppression and violence, and that we have many other ways of dealing with the harms that exist in our society. So it's a time, I think, to be making demands now that will keep people safe during COVID, but to also use this moment to demand things that will lead to a reduction in carceral populations over the long term, and eventually a movement towards a society that no longer needs prisons because we found better ways of taking care of each other.
Hmm. Yeah, it really seems like we need to start doing action. And that's what I'm wondering from you now. What could we do to help this situation?
I think it's kind of an everyday thing that people need to do. And it doesn't need to take a lot of time, but like I would start by following on social media various prison justice groups. So if you're on Twitter, there are many of them: Abolitionist Coalition, Toronto Prisoner Rights Project, Anti-Carceral Group, Pivot Legal Society in Vancouver, etc. You can do that on Facebook as well. One of the things that happens by following those groups is that you become aware of actions that are happening in prison. And so the most important thing that I think we can do is we can listen for these calls when prisoners are taking action and making demands, and then we can follow what they're asking us to do. So there have been a number of hunger strikes in the last year, more than probably in any 1 year span in the history of Canadian prisons. And every time there's a hunger strike, there's a series of demands that we need to amplify. And there's often calls to contact either, if it's a federal prison, our federal representatives; if it's a provincial prison, our provincial representatives. And so I think being poised to respond to those kinds of calls. And then beyond that, there aren't active calls right now, except for the calls to support migrants in the Laval Immigrant Detention Center. So I'd urge people to check out the Solidarity Across Borders website or Facebook page, see what you can do to support the hunger striking migrants, because that's just another prison. And then, take a bit of time to educate yourself on this system. And, we're all taught a lot about prisons that actually falls apart if you actually look at it. We're told that prisons keep us safe, that people in there are dangerous, that they need to be in there, that this is a reasonable and effective way of keeping our society safe. And I think that, if you start by reading Angela Davis's very short book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, you quickly come to perspective that that's not what the prison is there to do. It's not there to keep us safe. And we can develop better ways of taking care of each other.
Hmm. Yeah, I love Angela Davis. She's amazing. For everyone who's watching, I'm going to put some links of pages that you can follow. It seems to be really important that we spread awareness about the situation, that we don't just forget about them. They are citizens just like us. They deserve respect just like us. And Ted, I just wanted to know, is there anything else you wanted to add?
I think that's it. I'm glad you're covering this. Thanks for taking the time for this issue.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming and explaining it to us. It's not always clear what's happening, and I really appreciate that you came.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Ted. Have a great day.
You too.
And to everyone who's watching, thank you for watching. I hope that was very enlightening. Again, I'm going to be putting links to the groups in the comment section very soon. And yeah, please spread awareness. Thank you for any time that you dedicate to this. And yeah, have a great evening, everyone. Bye.